Good morning, Bison. So today we finish book one of this series. Yesterday, the population police came, did not find Luke. Jen's father was able to, manipulate them so that they wouldn't find him, but basically told him, you have to have a fake ID. He left it up to Luke, but Luke at the end decided that was probably what was best. So, chapter 30. Lee Grant settled into the car that would take him away from the farm where he'd found refuge after running away from home. He'd gotten lost. He'd certainly never intended to end up here. He surveyed the dusty barnyard in front of him, the ugly ruts of dried mud where tractors and trucks had left their tracks. He stared at the ramshackle barn and the peeling paint on the weathered house, sights that should have been entirely foreign to him, but weren't. Luke gulped, unable to keep thinking in his new identity quite yet. It was too soon, too hard, when his shoulders still felt the warmth of Mother's last hug. He looked down at his hands, clenched together in his lap, and they already seemed like someone else's against the background of his crisp new trousers. No more ragged blue jeans and hand-me-down flannel shirts for him. He had a whole suitcase in the trunk full of the same kind of fancy barren clothes he'd laughed at all those months ago. He didn't care about the clothes, but he wished they'd let him keep his name at least. Yet Jen's father had been proud that he had gotten to keep the same initials. A rush job like this? It's a wonder you're not stuck with Alphonse Zerze. He'd bragged in the letter he'd dropped off the night before, pretending he was just coming to ask Luke's parents to cut back the willow tree that draped over onto the Talbots' land. The real Lee Grant was a baron. He had died in a skiing accident just the night before. His parents wanted nothing to do with Luke. Too painful, Jen's father had explained, but they had agreed to donate their son's name and identity card the way people had once donated hearts and kidneys. Some secret group that helped third children had arranged it. The group had also agreed to pay for Luke to go to a private school as a boarder year-round. Supposedly, he was transferring in during the middle of a term as punishment for running away. He'd read about such places in the old books in the attic. It seemed a strange way to live, without family, but he was just as glad not to have to pretend to love another set of parents. Now Luke looked back at his family's porch where Mother and Dad and Matthew and Mark were standing and already waving. Dad and Matthew looked gruff, and Mark merely looked serious. Strange enough for him, but tears were streaming down Mother's face. She'd cried, too, the night Luke had told his parents everything. He'd started with his first visit to Jen's house, and Mother had immediately scolded. "Oh, Luke, how could you? The danger! I know you're lonely, but honey, promise us never again." "That's not all," Luke said. He told the rest of the story without looking at her until he reached the end and his decision to get a fake ID. Then the sound of her sobbing made it impossible to avoid looking. She was red-eyed, devastated. "Luke, no, you can't," she had gasped. "Don't you know how we'd miss you?" "But Mother, I don't want to go," Luke said. "It's just that I have to. I can't spend the rest of my life hiding in the attic. What will happen when you and Dad can't take care of me anymore?" "Matthew or Mark will," she replied. "But I don't want to be a burden on them. I want to do something with my life. Figure out ways to help other third kids. All the things he'd thought of sounded too childish to explain in the face of Mother sobbing. So he finished weakly. Make a difference in the world. "I'm not saying you can never do that," she'd answered. "But that's years away. We'll figure out some way to get a fake ID for you when you're grown up, somehow." She turned to Luke's father. "Tell him, Harlan." Dad sighed heavily. The boy's right. He needs to go now if he can. Luke could tell his father's words came out painfully, but they still stabbed at him. Maybe part of him had been secretly hoping his parents would forbid him to go, would lock him in the attic and keep him as their little boy forever. "I've checked around some, quiet-like, to see if anyone's heard of a third child getting to live a normal life. Around here they can't," Dad said. "Far as I can tell, he's not going to get another chance." Luke turned back to his mother because it was too hard to look at Dad while he was saying that. But the pain twisting Mother's face was worse. "Then I guess we don't have a choice," she'd murmured. That had been 2 days ago, and ever since then she'd called in sick to work and stayed home, spending every second with Luke. They had played board games and cards, but she'd interrupted every move with, "Do you remember?" or "I remember." The coups he'd made as a baby, his first steps, his delight in discovering dirt the spring he was 2, the first time he'd hoed a straight row, the zucchini he'd grown as long as his arm, the bedtime stories and tucking ins. She was filling him up with memories. He knew for the times when he'd have no one to talk to about his childhood. But it was hard to listen to. He wished they could just move their Monopoly pieces and pretend the time wasn't ticking away. But all too soon the morning had come. Jen's dad had pulled up in his fancy car and sprang out to shake hands with Luke's parents. "Mr. Garner, Mrs. Garner, thank you very much for reporting this boy's arrival immediately. From what I hear, the Grants were worried sick." He turned to Luke. "Young man, what you did was irresponsible and reckless. The only smart thing you did was remember to take your ID card. I guess you must have heard that the population police shoot first and ask questions later." He clapped Luke on the back and slid his hand down to slip something into Luke's pocket. Luke reached down to touch the stiff edge of an ID card. His ID card. "Do we have to start pretending already?" Luke's mother whispered, the tears beginning in her eyes. Jen's dad was shaking his head sternly and patting his chest, as if looking for something in a hidden pocket. "Bugged," he mouthed. When Luke's parents nodded to show they understood, he stopped patting and pulled out an official-looking paper. "Ah, here you are. Your travel papers. Your parents are sending you to Hendricks School for Boys. And if you don't shape up..." Jen's dad gave him a stern look that somehow also conveyed his sympathy. Mother cleared her throat, "would it be all right if we gave him a goodbye hug? We've gotten kind of fond of him in the time he's been here." Jen's father nodded, and then both Luke's parents held him tight and released him. "Be a good boy now, you hear?" Mother said. Luke could tell she was trying to make it jokey, the way she might talk to some other mother's runaway son, but for the life of him, he couldn't come back with a joking response. He only nodded, blinking hard. And then he stumbled to the car and tried to be Lee. Jen's dad circled the car and slid in on the driver's side. He started the car and pulled out. "You're just lucky you're getting such a highly paid chauffeur," he said. "If I weren't a personal friend of your father's cousin." Luke wasn't sure if there was a hidden message in the words, or if Jen's dad was just talking for the sake of the bug. He decided he couldn't analyze it yet. He peered back at his frantically waving family until they were out of sight. Soon the car was passing the other side of the barn and the field beyond. Views Luke had never seen, though he'd lived his entire life within 100 yards of them. In spite of the fear gnawing in his stomach and the anguish of missing his family, already he felt a thrill of excitement. There was so much to see. He'd have to tell Jen. Jen. The grief he'd been avoiding for days welled over him again. But, "I'm doing this for you too, Jen," he whispered, too softly for Jen's dad or the bug to hear over the car's hum. "Someday, when we're all free, all the third children, I'll tell everyone about you. They'll erect statues to you and name holidays after you." It wasn't much, but it made him feel better. A little. Luke stared back at his family's farm as long as he could. He could see just the roof of Jen's house beyond the sparse line of trees. And then, in no time at all, it seemed, everything familiar disappeared over the horizon. Lee Grant turned around to see what lay ahead. The end.